Today, I'm going to explain a sci-fi thriller movie called The Colony. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The movie opens in the distant future, where a global catastrophe caused by unrestrained exploitation of Earth has nearly wiped out humanity. The remaining people now reside in a space colony called Kepler 209, where living conditions are not particularly pleasant. Another major issue is that the colonists are unable to have children due to high radiation levels. As a result, a mission called Ulysses was dispatched to determine whether Earth is now suitable for settlement and whether it supports human fertility. However, contact was lost shortly after they landed on Earth, and no further communication was received. 15 years later, a second mission named Ulysses 2 is launched to Earth with 3 astronauts, Blake, Tucker, and Holden. This mission is especially important for Blake, as she's determined to know what happened to her father, who is a member of the first expedition. Ulysses 2's destination is a mud flat near the Henderson Hub, a critical measuring station that sends data back to Kepler 209. Unfortunately, the entry to Earth is much more difficult than anticipated, and the space capsule collides with a tidal flat near a weather beacon. Blake then swims to shore with all her strength and begins desperately searching for her companions. On the beach, she discovers Holden, but he is already dead. She then makes her way to the wrecked capsule and discovers Tucker. He is still alive, but has sustained a serious leg injury, leaving Blake in charge of their mission. The two also realize that there is no longer any radiation on Earth, meaning the planet is now fully habitable. Next, Blake sets off to explore alone, and starts by testing the water with a biometer, where she detects signs of life. She then encounters an animal resembling a jellyfish, but as she attempts to test it, it suddenly stings her wrist. Fortunately, Blake has medical supplies and quickly sprays it on her wound. At this moment, Tucker calls to warn her of an incoming storm and urges her to return. Blake agrees, but soon a thick fog surrounds her, and her vision is completely obscured. Tucker thus fires a flare into the sky, and Blake uses it to navigate her way back to the pod. However, as she gets closer to the pod, she notices a group of masked people dragging Tucker away. Blake hears her friend scream for help, but she feels too powerless to intervene. She uses her gun's scope to monitor the situation, but this is when someone sneaks up behind her and knocks her out. Sometime later, the two astronauts wake up in a hole filled with water. Blake realizes that Tucker's injuries are worsening, so she climbs up to look through the hole. She screams for help, claiming that her friend is about to die, but no one pays attention to her, and she quickly slips and falls back into the water. Shortly after, someone throws a rope into the hole, which Blake grabs and uses to climb out. She then notices a small community of humans, who are called the Muds. Following this, the people aggressively drag Blake away and demand that she treat an injured man. She tries to explain that she needs her medical supplies, which are still in the pod, but they don't understand or speak English. Moments later, a woman named Narvik appears, who turns out to be fluent in English. Blake describes the situation, and Narvik agrees to lead her to the pod. When they get there, our heroine finds the medical supplies, but she notices that all the ship's tech is damaged. Blake then begins treating the injured guy while secretly hiding some medications in her clothes. After her work is done, she is thrown back in the pit once again. Blake uses this opportunity to apply the medicine to Tucker and explains that she saw toddlers and children here, indicating that these people are fertile or they're midgets. She insists that all they need to do now is find the biometer and signal Kepler for help. However, Tucker regretfully informs her that he will be unable to accompany her because his condition has deteriorated significantly. He decides to take poison and end his life rather than endure more pain. Upon hearing this, Blake is flabbergasted and desperately tries to stop him, but Tucker refuses to listen and ends up taking the poison. This breaks her heart, and she collapses, sobbing over her dead friend's body. Shortly after, the tide suddenly rises and fills the hole, prompting Blake to climb up and scream for help. Fortunately, before she could drown, she's rescued by the man she had previously treated. He then takes her to one of the colony's boats before removing Tucker's lifeless body from the pit. The next morning, as the seawater begins to subside, Blake is thrown back into the well again. She notices her red bag containing the biometer in the hands of one of the children and asks for it back. However, the mischievous children begin mocking her by pouring water on her. Later, she is visited by Mila, a kind and sympathetic little girl. Blake then draws some pictures on the wall, and despite the language barrier, she manages to communicate with the little girl. Shortly after Mila leaves, several women and babies are thrown into the hole alongside Blake. She is then startled when she hears gunshots and screams coming from outside. Blake peers out from the hole and is shocked to see that the settlement is being attacked by a group of armed people. Several people are killed in the chaos, and others are kidnapped, including Mila, who has managed to get the red bag. After the attackers leave, Narvik appears and helps Blake and the other women in getting out of the hole. It is then revealed that Mila is her daughter, and she decides to go save her. Blake also follows her and expresses her willingness to help Narvik, but the latter is unsure whether she can trust this stranger. Soon after, they hear screams in the distance and rush toward the sound. They then climb a rock and watch the kidnapped people being transported on a ship. Desperate, Blake asks Narvik to fire a flare gun to distract the armed men, but the latter refuses as she intends to attack the men directly. With no other options, Blake knocks Narvik out and quickly fires the flare. This draws the attention of the men on the ship, who head toward the source of the beacon. Taking advantage of the situation, Blake dives into the water and climbs aboard the ship, where she finally finds the red bag. But before she can reach it, the men return to the ship, prompting her to blend in with the prisoners. Not long after, they all arrive at a facility where the prisoners are brought before a ruthless guard named Palin. He sends the boys off to work, while the women and girls are taken to a cabin. However, Palin soon notices that Blake is not local and decides to take her to the ship's leader, Gibson. When Gibson meets Blake, he greets her warmly and explains that they have been waiting for her arrival for a long time. He served under Blake's father as part of the first Ulysses mission and has met Blake when she was a child. The man then reveals that when they first arrived on Earth, the Mud people greeted them warmly, and Blake's father was very close to them. However, one day they rebelled, destroying the Ulysses pod and sabotaging its communication systems. It turns out that they also killed Blake's father during the chaos. Gibson then explains that he has been constructing a massive dam out of the ship's wreckage and using its turbine to generate electricity. He explains that in this way, the Kepler colony could survive on Earth if they ever return. At this point, a young boy named Neil arrives and interrupts their conversation. Gibson then introduces Blake to the boy, explaining that he is his son. Blake is confused because the boy looks like a local. So, Gibson clarifies that he adopted Neil after marrying his mother. Following this conversation, he takes Blake to her cabin, where she will have hot water to shower and a warm bed to sleep in. Blake is so grateful for the gesture, but once she's alone, she begins to recall old memories of her father and becomes emotional. The next morning, after Blake takes a shower, she notices blood between her legs and realizes that she is fertile now. Later, Gibson introduces her to a group of young girls who welcome her with a rehearsed song. Blake then tells them about the space colony and is surprised to see Mila among the students. However, the little girl does not appear to be happy to be here. Following the class, Blake wanders around the facility and comes across Neil. He reveals that he doesn't attend classes because his father gives him private lessons. The two then begin to bond, and the boy mentions a man named Christopher Columbus, who taught him about trees, and with whom he communicates through the ship's installation pipes. Upon hearing this, Blake is shocked and decides to find out about the mysterious person. Later, she takes the ship's map and proceeds to the cabin of the man Neil mentioned. When she arrives at the door, she is shocked to see that it is her own father. At this point, Gibson appears and begins to justify his lie, explaining that her father was actually the rebel leader because he fell in love with a mud woman. He then opens the door and Blake walks in to meet her dad after 15 long years. The two exchange an emotional hug, but Blake is disappointed and hurt that her father betrayed the mission and abandoned her. The old man just states that the Kepler residents should never return to Earth to avoid repeating past mistakes.
Screw the mission.
Why?
Because people suck.
Oh, okay. Upon hearing this, Blake is deeply hurt and walks out in tears. Later, she speaks with Gibson and informs him that she is fertile now. She explains that all she needs is her biometer to contact Kepler and share the news. Gibson is genuinely happy with the news, and he promises to recover the biometer, which is currently in the hands of his men. In the evening, while Blake is having dinner with Gibson and his family, the lights suddenly go out. Palin soon arrives and reveals that an intruder has broken in and knocked out several guards. Upon hearing this, Gibson prepares to confront the intruder, and he orders Blake to go to her room, but along the way she is met by Narvik, who turns out to be the intruder. Narvik threatens her with a knife and demands to see her daughter, so Blake is forced to comply. However, when they finally arrive at the girl's room, some guards appear and stop them. Palin then brutally beats up Narvik and orders his men to take her away. Before being dragged off, she manages to whisper to Blake that they only take the girls. In the next scene, Blake is treated by Gibson's wife, who comments that she has her father's eyes. Gibson also arrives to check on her and apologizes for what happened. He then reveals that Narvik used to be one of his guards before turning against him during the rebellion. Blake asks why he only keeps girls as hostages, and Gibson reveals his horrific breeding plans. He explains that these girls will serve as future sexual partners for the astronauts returning from Kepler 209, with their children laying the groundwork for Earth's repopulation. Upon hearing this, Blake is utterly disgusted, but pretends to remain unbothered. Later, when she returns to her room, she finds Mila hiding in her closet. Before they can even talk, Palin knocks on the door, saying a kid is missing. Blake reluctantly lets him in, but even after thoroughly searching the room, he cannot find Mila. Then, out of nowhere, he starts making advances on Blake. She firmly rejects him, but he aggressively pins her against the wall. At this moment, Palin hears a noise coming from the closet and moves to check it, but Blake cannot let him find the girl, so she reluctantly pulls him into a kiss. Seconds later, Palin begins to tremble and collapses to the ground. He then passes away within a minute. As it turns out, Blake had secretly placed a poison capsule in his mouth. Seizing the opportunity, she takes the guard's weapon and sets out to find Narvik with Mila. After knocking out several guards along the way, the two arrive at the cell where the prisoners are held as slaves and free them. The mother and daughter are also reunited in an emotional embrace. Meanwhile, Blake goes to see her father, who directs her to a window and points out something. Gibson is actually on his way to the Henderson hub, which is unusual given that he never leaves his ship. The two quickly realize that Gibson must have the biometer and is likely about to contact Kepler. This is intended to give the colonists a signal that they can return to Earth. Meanwhile, chaos breaks out as several mud people who have escaped clash with security guards. Blake also joins in the fight and takes out a few guards in her path. She eventually arrives at the Henderson hub, where she finds Gibson preparing to send the message to Kepler. Blake attempts to stop him, but Gibson grabs Neil as a hostage, threatening to kill him if she gets any closer. Blake believes it is a ruse, thinking he would never hurt his own son, but Gibson suddenly reveals a shocking truth. Neil is actually her half-brother, as they share the same father. He even shoots and kills the boy's mother when she tries to intervene. This barbaric act shocks Blake, and she has no choice but to lower her weapon, and Gibson proceeds to send the data to Kepler. However, while he is distracted, Blake seizes the opportunity to push him into the water. She then proceeds to strangle him underwater until he finally passes away. In the aftermath, Blake is also left unconscious, and she nearly drowns, but Narvik rescues her in the nick of time and performs CPR to revive her. After that, Blake and her father, along with the mud people, make their way to the settlement on a tugboat. Meanwhile, Neil is devastated by the loss of his mother, so Blake comforts him. She gives him a matchbox, a souvenir from her father, to remind him that he is a part of their family. Soon afterward, they arrive at the settlement, where we see some mud children who had previously managed to hide. The kids then anxiously observe several figures approaching through the fog. When they realize the figures are their kidnapped parents, they joyfully rush towards them, bringing the movie to an end.